Good morning, folks and family. It's April 22nd, 2020. On a Wednesday morning, it's 10:09 a.m. April 22nd, 2020, on a Wednesday morning, 10:09 a.m. And this is the Word for Today, Part 1 for March 12th, 2020. Once again, the Word for Today, Part 1 for March 12th, 2020. Let's go ahead and get in the Word of God today. And starting at the first entry, March 11th, 2020, at 3:33 p.m. Render respect unto whom respect is due, and render honor unto whom honor is due. Render respect unto whom respect is due, and render honor unto whom honor is due. I believe I was watching a soldier receiving the Medal of Honor, and inspired me to write that down. So these are the books that go along with that statement. Romans 13:7. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 27. Matthew chapter 17, verse 25. Matthew chapter 22, verse 21. Mark chapter 12, verse 17. Luke chapter 20, verse 22 and 25. Luke chapter 23, verse 2. Romans chapter 12, verse 10. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17. Leviticus chapter 19, verses 3 and 32. 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 18. Proverbs chapter 24, verse 21. Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. And finally the book Ephesians chapter 6, verses 2 and 3. Romans chapter 13, verse 7. Romans 13 and 7. Render therefore to their all due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 27. Proverbs 3 and 27. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in the power of your hand to do so. Matthew chapter 17, verse 25. Matthew 17 and 25. He said, yes. When he had come into the house, Jesus anticipated him, saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take customs or taxes? From their sons or from strangers? Matthew chapter 22, verse 21. Matthew 22 and 21. They said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Mark chapter 12, verse 17. Mark 12 and 17. And Jesus entered and said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marveled at him. Luke chapter 20, verses 22 and 25. Luke 20, verse 22. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Luke 20, verse 25. And he said to them, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Luke chapter 23, verse 2. Luke 23 and 2. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation, and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Romans chapter 12, verse 10. Romans 12, verse 10. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love and honor, giving preference to one another. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17. 1 Peter 2 and 17. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Leviticus chapter 19, verses 3 and 32. Leviticus 19 and 3. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Leviticus 19, verse 32. You shall rise before the gray-headed, and honor the presence of an old man, and fear your God. I am the Lord. 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 18. 1 Samuel 12 and 18. So Samuel called the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. Proverbs chapter 24, verse 21. Proverbs 24 and 21. My son, fear the Lord and the king. Do not associate with those given to change. Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. Exodus 20 and 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 2 and 3. Ephesians 6, 2 and 3. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. The next journal entry I have for you, 6:38 p.m., March 11, 2020. This is Jesus speaking to me. Count it all joy when they persecute you, Glenn, for they also persecuted me. Jesus. Count it all joy when they persecute you, Glenn, for they also persecuted me. Jesus. And this is the books of the Bible I have for you. Matthew chapter 5, verse 11 through 13, key verse 11. The book of James, chapter 1, verses 2 and 12. Luke chapter 6, verses 22 through 23. Acts chapter 5, verse 41. Romans chapter 8, verses 17 and 18, 35 through 37. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. Philippians chapter 1, verse 29. Philippians chapter 2, verse 17. Colossians chapter 1, verse 24. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 34. Matthew chapter 5, verses 11 through 13. Matthew 5, 11 through 13. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecute the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing, but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. James chapter 1, verses 2 and 12. James 1, verse 2. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. James 1, verse 12. Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verses 22 and 23. Luke 6, 22 and 23. Blessed are you when men hate you, and when they exclude you, and revile you, and cast out your name as evil, for the Son of Man's sake. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for indeed your reward is great in heaven, for in like manner their fathers did to the prophets. Acts chapter 5, verse 41. Acts 5 and 41. So they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were accounted worthy to suffer shame for his name. Romans chapter 8, verses 17 through 18, 35 and 37. Romans 8, 17 and 18. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs of Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Romans 8, 35 through 37. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are killed all day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. Yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore most glad I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Philippians chapter 1, verse 29. Philippians 1, verse 29. For to you it has been granted on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake. Philippians 2, verse 17. Philippians 2 and 17. Yes, I am being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith. I am glad and rejoice with you all. Colossians chapter 1, verse 24. Colossians 1 and 24. I now rejoice in my sufferings for you, and fill up my flesh what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ, for the sake of his body, which is the church. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 34. Hebrews 10 and 34. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. Okay, the next journal entry, March 11th, 2020, 6:44 p.m. This is Jesus speaking once again. They even persecuted the prophets that came before you. They even persecuted the prophets that came before you, Jesus. Okay, it's found in these books of the Bible. Matthew chapter 5, verse 12. Hebrew chapter 11, verses 36 through 38. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 13 through 16. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. Revelation chapter 2, verse 10. Matthew chapter 10, verses 38 through 39. Matthew chapter 27, verses 28 and 29. Romans chapter 5, verses 3 and 4. Romans chapter 8, verses 18 and 35. The Acts of the Apostles, chapter 26, verses 22 and 23. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 3. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. Philippians chapter 1, verse 29. Philippians chapter 3, verse 10. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 14. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 1. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 10. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. Job chapter 1, verses 20 and 21. Job chapter 5, verse 17. Psalm 34, verse 19. Isaiah 53, verses 3 and 4. Matthew chapter 5, verse 12. Matthew 5 and 12. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 36 through 38. Hebrews 11, 36 through 38. Still others had trials and mockings and scourgings, yes, and chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. 1 Peter 1, 6 through 8. In this you greatly rejoice, though now, for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen, you love, though now you do not see him, yet believing you rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory. 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 13 through 16. 1 Peter 4, 13 through 16. But rejoice to the extent that you have partaken of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad of exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. On their part he is blasphemed, but on your part he is glorified. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this manner. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. 2 Peter 2 and 9. Then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations, and to preserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment. Revelation chapter 2, verse 10. Revelation 2 and 10. Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. Matthew chapter 10, verses 38 through 39. Matthew 10, 38 and 39. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses it from his life for my sake will find it. Matthew 27, verses 28 and 29. Matthew chapter 27, verses 28 and 29. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. When they had twisted the crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! Romans chapter 5, verses 3 and 4. Romans 5, 3 and 4. And not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. Romans chapter 8, verses 18 and 35. Romans 8 and 18. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Romans 8 and 35. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? Acts chapter 26, verses 22 and 23. Acts 26, 22 and 23. Therefore, having obtained help from God, this day I stand witnessing both to small and great, saying no other things than those which the prophets and Moses said would come, that the Christ would suffer, that he would be the first to rise from the dead, and would proclaim light to the Jewish people and to the Gentiles. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 3. 1 Corinthians 13 and 3. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 5. 2 Corinthians 1 and 5. For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also abounds through Christ. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 17. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. Galatians 6 and 2. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Philippians chapter 1, verse 29. Philippians 1 and 29. For to you has been granted on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake. Philippians chapter 3, verse 10. Philippians 3 and 10. That I may know him in the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. 1 Peter 2 and 21. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that you should follow his steps. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 14. 1 Peter 3 and 14. But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed, and do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 1. 1 Peter 4 and 1. Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind, for he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 10. 1 Peter 5 and 10. But may the God of all grace, who called us to his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after you have suffered a while, perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. Deuteronomy 8 and 3. So he humbled you, allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. Job chapter 1, verses 20 and 21. Job 1, 20 and 21. Then Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head. And he fell to the ground and worshipped, and he said, Naked I come from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job chapter 5, verse 17. Job 5 and 17. Behold, happy is the man whom God corrects. Therefore do not despise the chastening of the Almighty. Psalm 34, verse 19. Psalm 34, verse 19. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. Isaiah chapter 53, verses 3 and 4. Isaiah 53, 3 and 4. He is despised, rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs, and carried our sorrows, yet we esteem him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. Okay, the next journal entry I have for you, March 11, 2020, 8:12 p.m. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. They are eternal and forever. Jesus. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. They are eternal and forever. Jesus. This is found in the book of Matthew, chapter 24, verses 35 to 39. Key verse 35. Matthew 24, 35 to 39. That on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zachariah, son of Bechariah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Or should I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I want to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you're not willing. See, your house has left you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more, till ye say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Okay, folks and family, that was chapter 23, verses 35 through 39. This is chapter 24, verses 35 through 39. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. But the day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the day of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Whereas in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until that day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. The final journal entry, March 11, 2020, 8:13 p.m. Behold, I make all things new. Write, for these things are faithful and true. Behold, I make all things new. Write, for these things are faithful and true. And this is found in the book of Revelation, chapter 21, verses 5 through 6, key verse 5. This is Jehovah God speaking when he told me this. Revelation 21, 5 and 6. And he sat on the throne and said, Behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, Write, for these words are true and faithful. And he said, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give of the fountain of the water of life freely to him who thirsts. Okay, folks and family, the Spotify worship song I have for you is by a group called G12 Worship. And the name of the song is All Things New. All Things New by G12 Worship. And I'll post that link in the description box below, as well as a link to the YouTube video you see listed here. Okay, folks and family, that's the Word for Today, Part 1, for March 12, 2020. Once again, the Word Today, Part 1, March 12, 2020. God bless you all and everything you do. God loves you, and so do I. Remember, Jesus Christ is coming soon. very soon. Today is your day of redemption and your day of salvation. Everyone have a blessed day. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you on the next video upload. And stay tuned for part 2 of this series, part 2 after this video finishes. Alright, take care of yourselves. Have a great day, and goodbye for now.